Johnny Carson revealed the 9 Golden Age guests who were actually evil. For 30 years, Johnny Carson brought America's biggest stars into living rooms across the country. His warm smile and
Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years, sitting across from tens of thousands of guests with a calm, needling wit that made even awkward moments look effortless. He never went on record branding any of them evil. That's not a word that shows up in his own accounts or in the memories of the people who worked closest with him, but he did talk at various points over the decades about specific guests and specific nights that tested him in very different ways. Drawing on his staff's later recollections, contemporaneous reporting, and surviving footage, here are 6 of the most well-documented cases. It's worth noting, before getting into those stories, that Carson himself was a considerably more complicated figure off-camera than his warm, unflappable on-air persona suggested, a detail that matters for weighing how much credibility to give any second-hand story about his private opinions of other people. Henry Bushkin, Carson's longtime attorney, business manager, and close friend for nearly 2 decades, published a memoir in 2013 describing a man who was, in his account, cold, guarded, and often difficult in his personal relationships, someone who, by Bushkin's telling, didn't attend either of his parents' funerals and once ended their friendship abruptly and without much warning over a business dispute. Bushkin has said publicly that Carson described himself in one Life magazine interview as basically an unhappy person, and has traced much of that unhappiness back to a strained relationship with his mother, Ruth, who Bushkin says was never satisfied by her son's success no matter how much he tried to please her. None of that makes Carson's own recollections of difficult guests unreliable, but is a useful reminder that the man behind the desk was, by the accounts of those closest to him, a far more guarded and private figure than his television persona let on, which is part of why so few of his genuine private opinions about guests ever made it into the public record with real, verifiable detail. Bob Hope, the guest Carson never quite warmed to. On the surface, Bob Hope and Johnny Carson looked like old friends. Hope appeared on The Tonight Show more often than almost any other guest, and the band even played Thanks to the Memory whenever he walked out. But according to Richard Zoglin's biography Hope, Entertainer of the Century, the relationship was considerably cooler behind the scenes than it appeared on air. Longtime Tonight Show producer Peter Larsally put it plainly, Johnny admired Hope's place in show business, but he was not a great admirer of his work. Part of the friction, according to Carson's former head writer Andrew Nichols, came down to a basic mismatch in style. Hope relied heavily on his own writers and arrived with prepared bits, often a 5-minute highlight reel from an upcoming special, even after being asked repeatedly to trim it to 2 minutes, while Carson thrived on quick, unscripted back and forth. Hope was a guy who relied on his writers for every topic, Nichols said. Johnny was very quick on his feet. He appreciated people who he felt engaged with the real world. There was nothing to talk to Bob about. The mismatch grew more pronounced as Hope aged and his hearing declined, since asking questions out of the order Hope expected could throw off his rehearsed answers entirely, a problem Zoglin's book describes as a recurring source of visible frustration for Carson as the years went on. According to Zoglin, after one particularly stilted appearance involving Hope's scripted answers late in his career, Carson turned to his writers afterward and said flatly, "If I ever end up like that, guys, I want you to shoot me." A comment less about Hope personally than about Carson's own dread of losing his improvisational edge with age. Larsally also recalled that Hope had an unusual standing arrangement to book himself on the show whenever he wanted, saying network executives would relay the request and Carson would sigh, again, before agreeing anyway, "You can't turn down Bob Hope." Notably, even as this tension simmered for decades, it never became public knowledge during either man's lifetime. Zoglin's book, published years after both men had died, was the first place any of this appeared in detail, which says something about how carefully Carson generally kept his private opinions of guests out of view. Uri Geller, the night Carson set a trap. Few Tonight Show appearances were as calculated, on Carson's part, as self-described psychic Uri Geller's 1973 visit. According to journalist Mark Malkoff's book Love Johnny Carson, Carson, a skilled amateur magician in his own right, had grown increasingly frustrated by Geller's rise to fame on the strength of tricks Carson believed were simple sleight of hand dressed up as genuine paranormal ability. Rather than confront Geller directly, Carson quietly arranged the conditions of the appearance himself. The props Geller was set to use, including spoons he intended to bend with his mind, were kept away from Geller and his team ahead of time, denying him any chance to rig or pre-treat the objects as he normally would before performance. The result was a spectacularly unsuccessful segment, stretching across nearly half an hour, in which Geller could manage only a slight bend in a single spoon. "I was humiliated," Geller told Malkoff decades later. "It was my first major TV show in America. By the end of the show, I was devastated. I thought to myself, Yui Geller, you are finished." Geller's career survived the setback, but the episode remains one of the clearest examples of Carson using his own platform and expertise to deliberately expose a guest rather than simply enduring a bad interview. Oliver Reed and Shelley Winters, Whiskey on live television. Of all the confrontations that ever happened on Carson's couch, few are remembered as vividly as the September 1975 collision between British actor Oliver Reed and American actress Shelley Winters, a pairing that, in hindsight, had all the ingredient for exactly this kind of collision. Winters, a two-time Oscar winner known even then for her outspokenness and unpredictability on talk shows, had already appeared earlier in the same episode, making her normal charming self, according to accounts of the taping, before leaving the stage. Reed, appearing on the show for the first time to promote his role in Ken Russell's Tommy, arrived by most accounts of the broadcast already fairly deep into a night of drinking, and introduced himself to the audience by declaring himself quite extraordinary before launching into an extended argument that a woman's proper role was in the kitchen, telling Carson and the audience, "I think a woman's place is looking after her man and her children, and I think a man's place is to look after her, to protect her, and to provide a bit of warmth." Some in the audience cheered. When a few heckled him, Reed shot back, "Shush, quiet, woman." At that point, Winters walked back out onto the stage mid-segment, approached Reed as he stood to greet her, and poured her drink directly over his head without saying a word, before turning and walking off again to wild applause. Reed, deadpan, sat back down and continued, "I think the women's liberation movement," a line that only intensified the crowd's reaction. Carson, rather than intervening or offering Reed a towel, simply told him to lick it off. Reed sat for a moment, dripping, before picking the conversation back up as though nothing unusual had happened at all, which is arguably what made the whole exchange land as well as it did on the broadcast. Neither man broke the moment by acknowledging how strange it actually was. Reed appeared on the show only twice more after that night and never returned following 1980, though it's worth noting the two men's paths crossed under considerably calmer circumstances in later years. Reed's reputation as a heavy drinker and self-described hellraiser long predated the incident and continued for the rest of his career, up until his death in 1999. Marlon Brando and Zazak Gabba, an on-air breakdown. More than a decade earlier, in May 1963, during a stretch when Carson was taping episodes live from Burbank, an unplanned collision between Marlon Brando and Zazak Gabba produced one of the show's earliest famous blow-ups. According to Mark Malkoff's account in Love, Johnny Carson, Brando arrived visibly drunk and sat down beside Gabba, who had been on set promoting her own face cream. Their exchange started warmly enough, with Brando calling Gabba fascinating and charming, but soured quickly once Gabba began interrupting him repeatedly. After Brando told what Malkoff describes as a weak knock-knock joke that drew only polite applause, Gabba needled him publicly. Only for Marlon Brando would they applaud for that. When she pivoted the conversation back to her face cream, Brando snapped, "Are we going to have to sit here all night and listen to your crappy plugs?" The exchange escalated into a full trade of insults, ending with Gabba storming off the set entirely while the cameras were still rolling, a genuinely unscripted collapse of two major stars' egos, live in front of Carson, who was left holding the segment together. Andy Kaufman, performance art Carson never fully trusted. Andy Kaufman's Tonight Show appearances occupy a stranger category than outright conflict. Carson and his staff were often genuinely unsure, in the moment, whether Kaufman's bits were comedy, provocation, or something closer to a psychological experiment being run on the audience itself. Kaufman's most notorious Carson-era Tonight Show moment wasn't with Carson at all, but with guest host David Letterman, when a stage feud with wrestler Jerry Lawler escalated into what appeared to be a real physical altercation, and a genuinely furious outburst of profanity from Kaufman on air, a moment audiences and even some crew members believe, for years afterward, might have been completely real. Kaufman never publicly confirmed how much of it was staged before his death in 1984, and the ambiguity itself became part of his legacy. For a show built around the idea that a host could always steer a guest back towards something coherent, Kaufman represented one of the few recurring exceptions, a guest whose appearances worked precisely because neither Carson nor the audience could ever be fully sure what they'd just watched. The competitive undertow with fellow comedians. Beyond individual clashes, Carson's decades on air also involved a subtler, ongoing tension with comedians whose styles or ambitions bumped up against his own position as the reigning king of late night. His cool relationship with Hope, described above, was one version of this. Biographers and former staffers have also pointed to the mutual competitiveness that colored some of his interactions with peers like Don Rickles, whose insult comic style occasionally produced genuinely tense exchanges rather than the affectionate ribbing seen in the show's more famous highlight reels. As evidence that Carson's easy, unbothered on-camera persona masked real professional rivalries he rarely discussed candidly in public. What actually connects these stories? None of this amounts to a list of evil guests, and it would be inaccurate to describe it that way. Carson himself never used that word, and most of what actually happened on his couch over 3 decades was warm, funny, and genuinely spontaneous, which is exactly why the show became the standard every late-night host since has been measured against. What these 6 accounts actually show is something more specific, how a live, largely unscripted format built on trust between a host and his guest occasionally broke down, through intoxication, ego, calculated exposure, unresolvable ambiguity, or simple professional rivalry, and how Carson, almost without exception, kept his own composure while the moment unfolded in front of millions of people. That composure, more than any single clash, is probably the real reason these particular nights are still being written about decades later.